Good morning. This is Saturday, June 15th, 2019. And we're reading in the book called The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. Last week we were reading about Charlene and them. They met. And he flew to a place and she flew to a place. They went to a restaurant. And they talked for a while and chatted. After that, they left and they both headed back home. So basically, that's where we were at. And so we'll continue where we left off. And we'll start reading, because this is a story, so I'll start reading from where we left off. The next morning, I awoke suddenly with a dream still fresh in my mind. For a minute or two, I stared at the bedroom ceiling, remembering it fully. I had been making my way through a forest, searching for something. The forest was large and exceptionally beautiful. In my quest, I found myself in a number of situations in which I felt totally lost and bewildered, unable to decide how to proceed. Incredibly, at each of these moments, a person would appear out of nowhere as though by design to clarify where I needed to go next. I never became aware of the object of my search, but the dream had left me feeling incredibly upbeat and confident. I sat up and I noticed a beam of sunlight coming through the window across the room. It sparkled with suspended dust particles. I walked over and pulled back the curtains. The day was radiant, blue sky, bright sunshine. A stiff breeze gently rocked the trees. The lake would be rippled and glistening this time of day, and the wind chilly against the swimmer's wet skin. I walked outside and I dove in. I surfaced and swam out to the middle of the lake, turning on my back to look at the familiar mountains. The lake rested in a deep valley where three mountain ridges converged. A perfect lake site discovered by my grandfather in his youth. It had not been 100 years since he had walked these ridges. A child explorer, a prodigy growing up in a world that was still wild with cougars and boars and Creek Indians that lived in a primitive cabins up on the North Ridge. He had sworn at the time that one day he would live in this perfect valley with its massive old trees and 7 springs. And finally, he had later to build a lake and a cabin and to take countless walks with a young grandson. I never quite understood my grandfather's fascination with this valley, but I had always tried to preserve the land, even when civilization encroached and surrounded. From the middle of the lake, I could see a particular rock outcropping near the crest of the North Ridge. The day before, in the tradition of my grandfather, I had climbed to that overhang, trying to find some peace in the view and in the smells and in the way the wind whirled in the treetops. And as I had sat up there, surveying the lake and the dense foliage in the valley below, I had slowly felt better, as if the energy and the perspective were dissolving some block in my mind. A few hours later, I had been talking with Charlene and hearing about the manuscript. I swam back and pulled myself up on the wooden pier in front of the cabin. I knew all this was too much to believe. I mean, here I was hiding out in these hills, feeling totally disenchanted with my life. When out of the blue, Charlene showed up and explained the cause of my restlessness. quoting some old manuscript that promises the secret of human existence. Yet, I also knew that Charlene's arrival was exactly the sort of coincidence of which the manuscript spoke, one that seemed too unlikely to be a mere chance event. Could this ancient document be correct? Have we been slowly building, in spite of our denial and cynicism, a critical mass of people conscious of these coincidences? Were humans now in a position to understand this phenomenon and thus finally to understand the purpose behind life itself? What I wondered, would this new understanding be? Would the remaining insights in the manuscript tell us, as the priest had said? I faced a decision because of the manuscript. I felt a new direction open in my life, a new point of interest. The question was, what do I do now? I could remain here, or I could find a way to explore further. The issue of danger entered my mind. Who had stolen Charlene's briefcase? Was it someone working to suppress the manuscript? How could I know? I thought about the possible risk for a long time, but finally my mood of optimism prevailed. I decided not to worry. I would be careful and go slowly. I walked inside and called the travel agency with the largest ad in the yellow pages. The agent with whom I spoke said he could indeed arrange a trip to Peru, and in fact, by chance, there was a cancellation I could fill, a flight with reservations already confirmed at a hotel in Lima. I could have the whole package at a discount, he said, if I could leave in 3 hours. 3 hours. The next chapter, The Longer Now. After a frenzy of packing and a wild ride on the freeway, I arrived at the airport with just enough time to pick up my ticket and board the flight for Peru. As I walked into the plane's tail section and sat down in a window seat, fatigue swept over me. I thought about a nap, but when I stretched out and closed my eyes, I found I couldn't relax. I suddenly felt nervous and ambivalent about the trip. Was it crazy to depart with no preparation? Where would I go in Peru? To whom would I talk? The confidence I had experienced at the lake was quickly feeding back into skepticism. Both the first insight and the idea of a cultural transformation again seemed fanciful and unrealistic. And as I thought about it, the concept of a second insight seemed just as unlikely. How could a new historical perspective institute our perception of these coincidences and keep these conscious in the public mind? I stretched out further and took a deep breath. Maybe it would be a useless trip. I concluded just a quick run to Peru and back. A waste of money, perhaps, but no real harm done. The plane jerked forward and taxied out to the runway. I closed my eyes and felt a mild dizziness as the big jet reached the critical speed and lifted into a thick cloud cover. When we reached cruising altitude, I finally relaxed and drifted into sleep. 30 or 40 minutes later, a stretch of turbulence woke me up, and I decided to go to the restroom. As I made my way through the lounge area, I noticed a tall man with brown glasses standing near the window talking to a flight attendant. He glanced at me briefly, then continued speaking. He had dark brown hair and appeared to be about 45 years old. For an instant, I thought I recognized him, but after looking at his features closely, I concluded he was no one I knew. As I walked past, I could hear part of the conversation. Thanks anyway, the man said. I just thought since you travel to Peru so often that perhaps you had heard something about the manuscript. He turned away and walked toward the front of the plane. I was dumbstruck. Was he speaking of the same manuscript? I walked into the restroom and I tried to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to forget about it. Probably he was talking about something else, some other book. I returned to my seat and closed my eyes again, content to write off the incident. Glad I didn't have to ask the man what he meant, but as I sat there, I thought about the excitement I had felt at the lake. What if this man actually had information about the manuscript? What might happen then if I didn't inquire? I would never know. I wavered several more times in my mind and then finally stood up and walked toward the front of the plane. Finding him about midway up the aisle, directly behind him was an empty seat. I walked back and told an attendant I wanted to move, then gathered my things and took the seat. After a few minutes, I tapped on his shoulder. "Excuse me," I said. "I heard you mention a manuscript. Were you speaking of the one found in Peru?" He looked surprised, then cautious. "Yes, I was," he said tentatively. I introduced myself and explained that a friend had been in Peru recently and had informed me of the manuscript's existence. He visibly relaxed and introduced himself as Wayne Dobson, an assistant professor of history from New York University. As we spoke, I noticed a look of irritation coming from the gentleman sitting next to me. He had leaned back in his seat and was attempting to sleep. "Have you seen the manuscript?" I asked the professor. "Parts of it," he said. "Have you?" "No, but my friend told me about the first insight." The man beside me changed his position. Dobson looked his way. "Excuse me, sir. I know we're disturbing you. Would it be too much trouble for you to exchange seats with me?" "No," the man said. "That would be preferable." We all stepped into the aisle, and then I slid back into the window seat, and Dobson sat beside me. "Tell me what you heard concerning the first insight," Dobson said. I paused for a moment, trying to sum up in my mind what I understood. I guess the first insight is an awesomeness of the mysterious occurrences that changes one's life, the feeling that some other process is operating. I felt assured as I said. Dobson picked up on my discomfort. "What do you think of that insight?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "It doesn't quite fit with our modern day common sense, does it? Wouldn't you feel better dismissing the whole idea and getting back to thinking about practical matters?" I laughed and nodded affirmatively. "Well, that's everyone's tendency. Even though we occasionally have the clear insight that something more is going on in life. Our habitual way of thinking is to consider such ideas unknowable and then to shrug off the awareness altogether. That's why the second insight is necessary. Once we see the historical background to our awareness, it seems more valid. I nodded. Then, as a historian, you think the manuscript's prediction of a global transformation is accurate? Yes, as a historian. Yes, but you have to look at history in the correct way. He took a deep breath. Believe me, I say this as one who has spent a lot of years studying and teaching history in the wrong way. I used to focus solely on the technological accomplishments of civilization and the great men who brought about this process. What's wrong with that approach? Nothing, as far as it goes. But what's really important is the world view of each historical period, what the people were feeling and thinking. It took me a long time to understand that. History is supposed to provide a knowledge of the longer context within which our lives take place. History is not just the evolution of technology. It is the evolution of thought. By understanding the reality of the people who came before us, we can see why we look at the world the way we do and what our contribution is toward further progress. We can pinpoint where we come in, so to speak, in the longer development of civilization. And that gives us a sense of where we are going. He paused, then added, the effect of the second insight is to provide exactly this kind of historical perspective, at least from the point of view of the Western thought. It places the manuscript's predictions in a longer context that makes them seem not only plausible, but inevitable. I asked Dobson how many insights he had seen, and he told me only the first two. He had found them, he said, after a rumor about the manuscript prompted a short trip to Peru 3 weeks ago. Once I arrived in Peru, he continued, I met a couple of people who confirmed the manuscript's existence, yet seemed scared to death to talk much about it. They said the government had gone a little loco and was making physical threats against anyone who had copies or dispersed information. His face turned serious. That made me nervous. But later, a waiter at my hotel told me about a priest he knew who often spoke of the manuscript. The waiter said that the priest was trying to fight the government's effort to suppress the artifact. I couldn't resist going to a private dwelling where this priest supposedly spent most of his time. I must have looked surprised because Dobson asked, what's wrong? My friend, I replied, the one who told me about the manuscript learned what she knew from a priest. He wouldn't give me his name, but she talked with him once about the first insight. She was scheduled to meet with him again, but he never showed up. It may have been the same man, Dobson said, because I couldn't find him either. The house was locked up and looked deserted. You never saw him? Nope, but I decided to look around. There was an old storage building in the back that was open, and for some reason I decided to explore inside. Behind some trash, under a loose board in the wall, I found translations of the first and second insights. He looked at me knowingly. You just happened to find them, I asked. Yes. Did you bring the insights with you on this trip? He shook his head. No, I decided to study them thoroughly and then leave them with some of my colleagues. Could you give me a summary of the second insight, I asked. There was a long pause, then Dobson smiled and nodded. I guess that's why we're here. The second insight, he said, puts our current awareness into a long historical perspective. After all, when the decade of the 90s is over, we'll be finishing up not only the 20th century, but a 1,000-year period of history as well. We'll be completing the entire second millennium. Before we in the West can understand where we are and what is going to occur next, we must understand what has really been happening during the current 1,000-year period. What does the manuscript say exactly, I asked. It says that at the close of the second millennium, that's now, we will be able to see that entire period of history as a whole. And we will identify a particular preoccupation that developed during the latter half of this millennium, in which has been called the modern age. Our awareness of the coincidences today represent a kind of awakening from this preoccupation. What's the preoccupation, I asked. He gave me a mischievous half smile. Are you ready to relive the millennium? Sure. Tell me about it. It's not enough for me to tell you about it. Remember what I said before. To understand history, you must grasp how your everyday view of the world developed, how it was created by the reality of the people who lived before you. It took 1,000 years to evolve the modern way of looking at things. And to really understand where you are today, you must take yourself back to the year 1000 and then move forward through the entire millennium exponentially, as though you actually lived through the whole period yourself in a single lifetime. Wow, how do you do that? I'll guide you through it. I hesitated for a minute, glancing out the window at the land formations far below. It was already beginning to feel different. I'll try, I said finally. Okay. He replied, imagine yourself being alive in the year 1000, in what we called the Middle Ages. The first thing you must understand is that reality of this time is being defined by the powerful churchmen of the Christian church. Because of their position, these men hold great influence over the minds of the populace. And the world these churchmen described as real is, above all, spiritual. They are creating a reality which places their idea about God's plan for mankind at the very center of life. Visualize this, he continued. You find yourself in the class of your father, essentially peasant or aristocrat. You know that you will always be confined to this class. But regardless of which class you're in or the particular work that you do, you soon realize that social position is secondary to the spiritual reality of life as defined by the churchman. Life is about passing a spiritual test. You discover the churchman explained that God has placed mankind at the center of the universe, surrounded by the entire cosmos, for one solitary purpose: to win or lose salvation. And in this trial, you must correctly choose between two opposing forces: the force of God and the luring temptations of the devil. But understand that you don't face this contest alone, he continued. In fact, as a mere individual, you aren't qualified to determine your status in this regard. This is the providence of the churchmen. They are there to interpret the scriptures and to tell you every step of the way whether you are in accordance with God or whether you are being duped by Satan. If you follow their instructions, you are assured that a rewarding afterlife will follow. But if you fail to heed the course they prescribe, there is excommunication and certain damnation. Dobson looked at me intensely. The manuscript says that the important thing to understand here is that every aspect of the medieval world is defined in otherworldly terms. All the phenomenon of life, from the chance thunderstorm or earthquake to the success of crops or the death of a loved one, is defined either as the will of God or as the malice of the devil. There is no concept of weather or geological forces to horticulture or disease. All that comes later. For now, you completely believe the churchman. The world you take for granted operates solely by spiritual means. He stopped talking and looked at me. Are you there? Yes, I can see that reality. Well, imagine that reality now beginning to break down. What do you mean? The medieval world view, your world view, begins to fall apart in the 14th and 15th centuries. First, you notice certain improprieties on the part of the churchmen themselves, secretly violating their vows of chastity. For example, or taking gratitudes to look the other way when governmental officials violate spiritual laws. These improprieties alarm you because these churchmen hold themselves to be the only connection between yourself and God. Remember, they are the only interpreters of the scriptures, the sole arbitrators of your salvation. Suddenly, you are in the midst of an outright rebellion. A group led by Martin Luther is calling for a complete break from papal Christianity. The churchmen are corrupt. They say demanding an end to the churchman's reign over the minds of the people. New churches are being formed based on the idea that each person should be able to have access to the scriptures personally and to interpret them as they wish with no middleman. As you watch in disbelief, the rebellion succeeds. The churchmen begin to lose. For centuries, these men defined reality. And now, before your eyes, they are losing their credibility. Consequently, the whole world is being thrown into question. The clear consciousness about the nature of the universe and about humankind's purpose here, based as it was on the churchman's description, is collapsing, leaving you and all the other humans in Western culture in a very precarious place. After all, you have grown accustomed to having an authority in your life to define reality. And without that external direction, you feel confused and lost. If the churchman's description of reality and the reason for human existence is wrong, you ask, then what is right? He paused for a moment. Do you see the impact of this collapse on the people of that day? I suppose it was somewhat unsettling, I said. To say the least, he replied. There was a tremendous upheaval. The old worldview was being challenged everywhere. In fact, by the 1600s, astronomers had proven beyond a doubt that the sun and the stars did not revolve around the earth as maintained by the church. Clearly, the earth was only one small planet orbiting a minor sun in a galaxy that contained billions of such stars. He leaned forward towards me. This is important. Mankind has lost its place at the center of God's universe. See the effect this had? Now, when you watch the weather or plants growing or someone suddenly die, what you feel is an anxious bafflement. In the past, you might have said God was responsible or the devil. But as the medieval worldviews break down, that certainly goes with it. All the things you took for granted now need new definitions, especially the nature of God and your relationship to God. With that awareness, he went on, the modern age begins. There is a growing democratic spirit and a mass distrust of papal and royal authority. Definitions of the universe based on speculation or spiritual faith are no longer automatically accepted. In spite of the loss of certainty, we didn't want to risk some new group controlling our reality as the churchmen had. If you had been there, you would have participated in the creation of a new mandate for science. A what? He laughed. He would have looked out on this vast, undefined universe, and you would have thought, as did the thinkers of that day, that we needed a method of conscious building, a way to systematically explore this new world of ours. And you would have called this new way of discovering reality the scientific method, which is nothing more than testing an idea about how the universe works, arriving afterward at some conclusion, and then offering this conclusion to others to see if they agree. Then, he continued, you would have prepared explorers to go out into this new universe, each armed with a scientific method, and you would have given them their historic mission. Explore this place and find out how it works and what it means that we find ourselves alive here. You know, you had lost your certainty about a God-ruled universe, and because of that, your certainty about the nature of God himself. But you felt you had a method, a conscious building process through which you could discover the nature of everything around you, including God, and including the true purpose of mankind's existence on the planet. So you sent these explorers out to find the true nature of your situation and to report back. He paused and looked at me. The manuscript, he said, says that at this point we began the preoccupation from which we are awakening now. We sent these explorers out to bring back a complete explanation of our existence. But because of the complexity of the universe, they weren't able to return right away. What was the preoccupation? Well, put yourself in that time period again, he said. When the scientific method couldn't bring back a new picture of God and of mankind's purpose on the planet, the lack. Somebody popped in. Hello, Sandy. I hear something.
Hi, Robert. It's Sandy.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you? I'm sorry I'm so late. I had a phone call.
Oh, no problem. I just been reading away.
Good. Yeah, the book is good. I'm gonna have to catch up with you online.
Yeah, or you can, go to YouTube and look it up
Oh, yeah.
and play it through. Anyway, we've been talking quite a bit. He decided to go to Peru, and so he got on a plane to go to Peru, and in the process, he met someone on the plane that knew something about the manuscript, and so they've been sitting on the
Uh-oh.
plane talking about the manuscript,
Uh-huh. Okay.
and it's very interesting. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and continue on.
Okay.
And he's talking to the gentleman on the plane now, so you'll know what we're talking
Okay.
about. And so this is the gentleman talking. Put yourself in that time period again, he said, when the scientific method couldn't bring back a new picture of God and of mankind's purpose on the planet. The lack of certainty and meaning affected Western culture deeply. And he's talking about the 16th century now, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We needed something else to do until our questions were answered. Eventually, we arrived at what seemed to be a very logical solution. We that the original manuscript be made public. I sent a letter to the relevant department heads within the Peruvian government, telling them that I was coming and that I expected cooperation. I see. I wonder how they will respond. probably with denials, but at least it will be an official start. Excuse me. He turned away deep in thought, and I stared out the window again. As I looked down, it dawned on me that the airplane on which we were riding contained within its technology 4 centuries of progress. We had learned much about manipulating the resources we had found on the earth. How many people, I mused, how many generations did it take to create the products and the understanding that enabled this airplane to come into being? And how many spent their whole lives focused on one tiny aspect, one small step, without ever lifting their heads from that preoccupation? Suddenly, in that instant, the span of history, Dobson, and that's the name of the gentleman he met, and I had been discussing seemed to integrate fully into my consciousness. I could see the millennium clearly, as though it was part of my own life history. 1,000 years ago, we had lived in a world where God and human spirituality were clearly defined. And then we had lost it. Or better, we had decided there was more to the story. Accordingly, we had sent explorers out to discover the real truth and to report back. And when they had taken too long, we had become preoccupied with a new secular purpose, one of settling into the world, of making ourselves more comfortable. And settled we had. We discovered that the metallic cores could be melted down and fashioned into all kinds of gadgets. We invented sources of power, first steam, then gas and electric and fusion. We systemized farming and mass production, and now commanded huge stores of material goods and vast networks of distribution. Propelling it all was the call to progress, the desire of the individual to provide his own security, his own purpose while he was waiting for the truth. We had decided to create a more comfortable and pleasurable life for ourselves and our children. And in a mere 400 years, our preoccupation had created a human world where all the comforts of life could now be produced. The problem was that our focus, obsessive drive to conquer nature and make ourselves more comfortable, had left the natural system of the planet polluted, on the verge of collapse. We couldn't go on this way. Dobson was right. The second insight did make our new awareness seem inevitable. We were reaching a climax in our cultural purpose. We were accomplishing what we had collectively decided to do. And as this happened, our preoccupation was breaking down, and we were walking up to something else. I could almost see the momentum of the modern age. Slowly, as we approached the end of the millennium, a 400-year-old obsession had been completed. We had created the means of material security, and now we seemed to be ready, poised, in fact, to find out why we had done it. In the faces of the passengers around me, I could see evidence of the preoccupation. But also, I thought, I detected brief glimpses of awareness. How many, I wondered, had really noticed the coincidences? The plane tilted forward and we began its descent as the flight attendant announced that we would soon be landing in Lima, Peru. I gave Dobson the name of my hotel and asked where he was staying. He gave me the name of his hotel and I said it was only a couple of miles from mine. What is your plan? I asked. I've been thinking about that, he replied. The first thing, I guess, is to visit the American embassy and tell them why I'm here, just for the record. Good idea. After that, I'm going to speak with as many Peruvian scientists as I can. The scientists at the University of Lima have already told me that they have no knowledge of the manuscript. But there are other scientists who are working at the various ruins who may be willing to talk. What about you? What are your plans? I have none, replied. I do. Do you mind if I tag along? Not at all. I was going to suggest it. I have a room over the alley. I was looking out the window as they were chasing you. Whoops, did I skip a page? Oh, I guess I did. After the plane landed, we picked up our luggage and agreed to meet later at Dobson's hotel. I walked outside, hailed a taxi in the fading twilight. The air was dry and the wind very brisk. As my cab drove away, I noticed another taxi pull out quickly behind us, then lag back in the traffic. It stayed with us through several turns, and I could make out a long figure in the back. A rush of nervousness filled my stomach. I asked the driver, who could speak English, not to go directly to the hotel, but to drive around for a while. I told him I was interested in sightseeing. He complied without comment. The taxi followed. What was this all about? When we arrived at my hotel, I told the driver to stay in the car. Then I opened my door and pretended to be paying the fare. The taxi following behind us pulled up to the curb some distance away, and a man stepped out and walked slowly toward the hotel entrance. I jumped back into the vehicle and shut the door, telling the cabbie to drive on. As we sped away, the man walked into the street and watched us until we were out of sight. I could see my driver's face in the rear view mirror. He was watching me closely, his expression tense. Sorry about this, I said. I've decided to change accommodations. I struggled to smile, then gave him the name of Dobson's Hotel. Although part of me wanted to go straight to the airport and take the first plane back to the States. A half block short of our destination, I had the driver pull over. Wait here, I told him. I'll be right back. The streets were filled with people, mostly native Peruvians. I have a hard time pronouncing that word. But here and there I passed some Americans and Europeans. Something about seeing the tourists made me feel safer. When I was within 50 yards of the hotel, I stopped. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, as I watched, gunshots rang out and screams filled the air. The crowd in front of me flung themselves into the ground, opening up my view down the sidewalk. Dobson was running toward me, wide-eyed, panicked. Figures behind him pursued. One fired his gun into the air and ordered Dobson to halt. As he ran closer, Dobson strained to focus, then recognized me. Run, he yelled. For God's sake, run. I turned and ran down an alley in terror. Ahead was a vertical board fence 6 feet high, blocking my way. When I reached it, I leaped as high as I could, catching the top of the boards with my hands and fingering my right leg over the top. As I pulled my left leg over and dropped to the other side, I looked back down the alley. Dobson was running desperately. More shots were fired. He stumbled and fell. I continued to run blindly, leaping piles of trash, stacks of cardboard boxes. For a moment I thought I had footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Ahead, the alley ran into the next street, which was also crowded with people, seemingly unalarmed. As I entered the street, I dared a glance to my rear, my heart pounding. No one was there. I walked hurriedly down the sidewalk to the right, trying to fade into the crowd. Why did Dobson run? I asked myself. Was he killed? Wait a minute. I guess I better stop there. The time is getting run out. So we'll stop here at wait a minute. That's a good place to stop. So it is. It's a really, really interesting novel that has a lot of foresight to it. That's why I got it originally, and I've actually read it 3 times, so this will be the 4th time I've read it.
Wow.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a good book. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording part of this.